Just to get us started, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, saying who you are, what is your position, which organization you work for, and anything else that you want to share. And meanwhile, I will introduce myself, Accountable Now, very quickly before handing over to Viviana and getting started. So I am Héctor Payo. I am the Membership and Reporting Manager for Accountable Now. I am based in Berlin, and I will be supporting Viviana and the rest of the panelists in this webinar. Accountable Now is a membership network that works with civil society organizations from across the world on improving accountability practices through a comprehensive reporting process and many other initiatives, like, for example, this webinar. So now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce and let Viviana start the webinar. Viviana Farfán Andrade is the Global Safeguarding Specialist in Educo, and she's based in beautiful La Paz in Bolivia. And I let her to introduce better herself and get us started. Over to you, Viviana.
Thank you, Hector. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. We're very enthusiastic about this webinar because we're trying a new format, and it's a very interesting and relevant matter, the one we are going to be touching today about embedding safeguarding in programming. As Hector said, my name is Viviana. I work at Educo. We're a global organization that works for the rights of children and adolescents in several countries in America, in Africa, and also in Asia. We're based in Spain, in Barcelona, but I'm based in Bolivia, as Hector said before. So now I'm going to start by introducing our panelists. We have 3 people joining us today to share their experiences. We are going to be structuring this webinar with 4 questions. Each question is going to be answered by each one of the panelists. And the chat is open for questions from you, from the participants. So as we develop the webinar, you can start asking other questions. We're going to have a little time for the panelists to answer the questions that we're giving, and then we're going to stop and answer some of your questions at the chat. Hopefully we'll be able to answer all of them. If we can't, because there are too many or we have too little time, we are going to be resending the answers with the recording of this webinar, so everyone has some of the information that you asked for. So now let's start introducing each one of our panelists. First of all, we have Cheri Erasmus. Cheri-Leigh Erasmus is Global Director of Learning at Accountability Lab. Also, we have Coenraad. He is Head of Childcare and Safeguarding at SOS Children's Villages International. And Edla Muga, who is Safeguarding Advisor at Oxfam International. Thank you to the 3 of them for your availability and for being able to share your experiences with us, which would be very, very useful, no doubt. Now let's start with the first question. Any one of the panelists can start answering, and then we move on to the next one. The first question is, how do you think can CSOs strengthen and build protective environments more effectively? Who wants to answer first?
Edla, Viviana, I'm happy to jump in.
Okay, Cheri, go ahead.
First, and just to say, if I do switch off my camera to the rest of our attendees here, it's just because I am having some difficulties today. I'm dialing in from Harare in Zimbabwe, and the Wi-Fi gods are not smiling upon me. So I may just mitigate that by turning my camera off if it becomes unstable. As Viviana mentioned, I work as Global Director of Learning at the Accountability Lab. We are a non-governmental organization that works on issues related to governance and corruption across 12 countries, ranging from geographies in South Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Our approach is really to bring young people, women, people with disabilities, and other traditionally excluded groups into the conversation around accountability, good governance, and anti-corruption efforts. And this means that we use creative means to get people involved who are otherwise not included in these conversations. We're trying to spark participation amongst individuals who generally don't join conversations around governance. Now, as such, we do not really work with people under the age of 18. And so when it comes to safeguarding, our approach to safeguarding is not that of an organization focused on child safeguarding. For our purposes, we take a broader and more holistic approach when it comes to safeguarding of our program participants, as well as our program staff and anyone associated really to our work. Our approach is understanding that within the contexts where we work, in countries with entrenched corruption, countries with poverty, illiteracy, and all sorts of socioeconomics, safeguarding also means safeguarding people for those imbalances of power and having an understanding that it's not just age or gender that can make you vulnerable, but that these dynamics around power, having and not having, can really create dynamics that make people vulnerable. And so our approach is to really look with concrete evidence and empathy at the environments where we work and to localize policies based on what is appropriate in that context. This requires really a deep understanding of not just the socio-political context of a space, but also the cultural context and the physical surroundings, so that you're able to build safeguarding policies that not only make sense in theory, but are actually applicable. We also want everyone across our organization to really understand and be able to onboard our safeguarding practices. The last thing we want to do is create elaborate policies that in practice cannot be implemented. That creates just more confusion and liability issues, and creates for a space that we foster, how should I call it, unrealistic expectations of what we are able to do. Additionally, I think for me, the most important way in which we try to strengthen our safeguarding policies is to be extremely realistic about risks, and by building policies that are ready for the worst things to happen. Now, this might sound really pessimistic or cynical even, but I'm very worried when organizations take the approach of it will never happen here, or no one here would do that. I think it's really important that our policies are built for the worst to happen, because it could happen in any organization, even when we think we know all of our staff and all of our volunteers. So that is my one key thing about strengthening safeguarding policies. It is about being ready for the worst to happen.
Great, thank you very much, Cheri. Edla, what do you have to say about this?
Hi, everyone. So as you've been informed, my name is Edla. I am part of what we call humanitarian support personnel, which is a form of roster. So we work under what we have within Oxfam called Global Humanitarian Team. And our work is to support different country programs across different affiliates in the Middle East, Africa, and Europe, Asia, in different technical areas. So as a safeguarding advisor, my role is to provide that kind of technical support in different emergencies. So I've been listening to our colleague, and I don't want to sort of repeat what she said. So my approach, because I'm mostly someone who's on the ground, is going to be a little bit more practical. So one of the ways in which we can CSOs can strengthen and build protective environments more effectively is joining and actively participating in PSEA networks. So UNICEF currently has the mandate to establish PSEA networks across different responses. And PSEA networks go a long way in supporting CSOs with relevant policies, strategy, action points, information, education, communication material, and provides a platform for the teams in the emergency to be able to do training and advocacy platforms. There are different versions of PSEA networks. Some are very inclusive and include different types of CSOs, while others are more UN-led. And therefore, if CSOs find that their particular PSEA network, for whatever reason, is heavily UN-led, then it would be good to form a separate sort of network, sort of pull out, and then work on what is important to the other CSOs, find their bearing, and then jointly present ideas for adoption and advocacy within the larger formal PSEA networks. So that should not be sort of a hindrance to the participation. Another thing they can do is ensure that there are codes of conduct, which all new staff that are joining, partners, contractors, and other types of suppliers can be signing. And this include guidance on safeguarding, the codes of conduct, apart from other types of behavior. Another way would be providing awareness raising amongst staff, amongst partners, amongst suppliers, and also in the communities in need where we are working, so that our beneficiaries also have an awareness of what safeguarding are, what are the parameters, and survivors know where to go for support whenever a safeguarding incident occurs. Risk assessments for programs and projects should consider safeguarding issues as well, so that this can be included within the project work plan. And then necessary funding and necessary activities are put in place, and the right personnel are brought on board to be able to mitigate the relevant risks. And finally, just to say that although Oxfam is not a child rights organization per se, we do understand that everywhere where we work, particularly for organizations working on gender issues and working among vulnerable people, most of the time, vulnerable people who are fleeing or who require the kind of support that Oxfam gives include children as well. And therefore, we do have a child safeguarding policy. And when we do our training and whatever we do, we also make sure that we introduce that element of what to do with child safeguarding. And our guidelines include promoting the idea that our staff, our partners, and other people working around can consult with child rights organizations when they are not sure what to do, and bring them on board to make sure that the children are also safe. So I'll just leave that there and, for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Edla. So we had a more strategic approach from Cheri and from the point of view that Accountability Lab works at. And now from Edla, a more operational perspective on how to embed safeguarding on programming. Now we have Coenraad, who's from SOS Children's Village, and might give us a perspective more focused on child safeguarding, perhaps.
Thank you very much, Viviana, and very valuable input from both Cheri and Edla on the topics. And from that, I would perhaps would like to add two particular aspects in terms of how CSOs could strengthen and build protective environments more effectively. And you know, the one to start off that I think is very valuable for organizations, and which was a critical element for us as well to reflect on how we can do that, is to on a regular basis to do an independent child safeguarding review of critical cases that occurred within the organization. And we've just recently went through a process where we've reviewed the organizational response to 4 cases of a historical nature. And that proved to be very valuable in highlighting essential issues that we need to address within the organization to strengthen the establishment of a safe environment within the organizations and the programs and the communities where we work on. And these are not easy processes for organizations. Those are very hard processes for organizations to go through, but what we've realized is that it provides rich opportunities for staff, for our partners, and beneficiaries to have discussions around critical matters, and also looking at potential solutions and actions that needs to be put in place to strengthen safeguarding within the organization. So that is the first aspect that I want to highlight, this independent review of actual cases and how the organization responded. The second thing I want to highlight, and this has been a bit of a discussion that we've had in the organization. We all know that safeguarding has received a lot of attention, and of course, rightfully so as well. It receives a whole lot of focus in the broader discourse of the organization's programming and operations. But one thing that we've also realized is, while in certain programs or contexts that safeguarding received a lot of attention, that we should also not lose out of the picture that we need to focus on implementing quality programs. That some of the basic things that we are doing as organization in terms of implementing programs, sometimes we tend to shift that focus to safeguarding and forget some of the basic things that we need to do in the first place. And therefore, it's also essential to keep in mind to still focus on those basic issues that ensures quality programming, which means, of course, the participation of children, young people, adults that we work with, that have appropriate processes in place to engage with staff, that ensures a proper planning and results-based way of working towards achieving outcomes. Some of those things form the foundation for a safe environment. And we should not lose perspective on that. And that is just the second thing that I want to highlight. Of course, there are a lot of other issues that Cheri and Edla also already touched on, but I think I will just leave it there for now.
Thank you so much, Coenraad. I think that's a very valuable point that you touched. I mean, safeguarding, as we've been talking about in the previous webinars we had, is a very important issue that all organizations must address in order to keep on working in the line of respect of the human rights, but also is not something that we need to start. Is not the only thing we need to start worrying about. And the quality in programming is something that must come with safeguarding hand in hand. So thank you. I think it's a very, very, very important point that you touched. Now we can start with the second question. Maybe we can answer in the same order, starting with Cheri and ending with Coenraad. The second question is, how can CSOs create a common understanding within the communities where programs take place about the safeguarding processes? Cheri?
Thank you, Viviana. This is a question that sounds that sounds much easier than it is, I think, to answer. The reason being, I'm going to use on a very practical level the Accountability Lab as an example. So we work across 12 countries and we have a centrally developed safeguarding policy that then gets localized by each individual accountability lab, whether that is in Pakistan or in Liberia or in Nigeria, for example. Often it can happen, this isn't always the case, but it can happen that things that are seen as on a global level for us as professionals in the civil society space, what can be seen for us as standards or good practices with regards to safeguarding do not always align, even in countries, with what is not only a cultural norm, but what is legally seen as a safeguarding issue. So an example of that might be there are countries, and I'm sure all of us on this call have had touch points with such countries where issues around the LGBT community are incredibly sensitive, where the rights of members of the LGBT community are not necessarily protected. However, within our safeguarding policy, those individuals would be seen as part of a marginalized and at-risk community who should be safeguarded, whose rights we should be protecting, and we should do, our very best to ensure that no harm comes to them as a result of our programming. And so this thing gets me back to the point I made in my introduction, that in the spaces where we work, we not only have to pay close attention to how we contextualize what we do, but we really need to bring our team members, our volunteers, and our communities into that conversation alongside us. Sometimes rolling out and training people on a safeguarding policy can in ways be more than that. It can be a way that it can be an opportunity to really sensitize people to a group that is otherwise overlooked, or a piece of our daily life that can maybe marginalize a particular group of people. But that's impossible to do if we create centralized safeguarding policies that ultimately just get fed down to people and everyone needs to adhere to it. I think that creates a situation where people disengage from it because they might see it as something that's just thrust upon them, and they may not have themselves interrogated some of their strongly held beliefs or cultural norms, or even interrogated discrimination caused by the laws of their country. So I think it's incredibly important that we bring everyone along for the ride as we make policy and as we sensitize each other to policy, and find that sweet spot where people are protected, but also by using the words and the methods that make sense within that context.
Thank you, Cheri. Edla?
Yeah, so one of the things that Cheri has said that's really key is that we really need to be flexible. What would remain as common understanding would be, what is safeguarding? What does it mean? What are for example, the 6 IAC core principles? That would be what we need to have a common understanding on. But when it comes to the processes, then flexibility would be key. And the situation is different depending, of course, on the location and the areas where you are. So again, from a practical perspective, it's important to include safeguarding or PSEA data assessment questions in our baseline assessments, for example, so that we gather information about the location where we are, the situation on the ground. And safeguarding and PSEA should be a topic of discussion at inception workshops, so that it's something that everybody who's going to be working on the project talks about. Another learning that we have is communities should receive awareness raising on safeguarding issues and should be engaged in assessing what the best modes of reporting are. This also includes when we do interpretation of different principles in safeguarding. The definition of that term is still really a problem in certain languages. So we have to make sure that when we translate the information that we have, we do it in a way that makes as much sense in that local language as possible, as close to what safeguarding actually means as possible. Instead of parallel or alternative safeguarding systems, it's also important to work with existing confidential systems to set up reporting mechanisms and identify existing support systems. For example, if you have certain stakeholders who are already trusted with sensitive information, it doesn't make sense to have different focal points or project-related focal points who work on safeguarding and help to do the reporting and help to provide support, but maybe find a way of supporting those existing personalities or make use of the existing systems to be able to bring the report forward. We've also found that information, education, communication materials, what we call IEC material, like posters, should be context specific and tested locally. So the message of, for example, within the IEC core standards is what would be standard, and we don't deviate from that. However, the cartoons and the content of the pictures, and as I said, the words and the translation should be locally tested before being distributed, and also done in collaboration with people on the ground. We also need to involve local communities when we need to establish safeguarding systems, when we are doing the assessments, when we are testing, and in different discussions. We also need to find out what already exists and works, and then support that, so long as it fits within the parameters of the ISC core standards. For example, if we have social workers or trusted CSO leads who are already receiving confidential information, they can also be trained as safeguarding focal persons, who can then be focal persons for people to report to, and who can also be used to support with awareness raising. Another thing that is important for Oxfam is the importance of having long-term Dbv and gender programs, which support long-term behavior change that can benefit safeguarding processes. This is very important, and just to solidify that, I just want to share an example from our experience. In one of our country programs, there was a particular town, and in that town, the culture is that children go to work. So as you all know, when we do emergency programming or different types of programming, we need to liaise with the local authorities. For example, when you bring in some new form of employment, it's important for the local authorities to be involved in terms of selecting the people who will be working on that project. So we had a meeting with our contractors and suppliers. We were training them on safeguarding. We were getting their opinions on our code of conduct for affiliated personnel. And they informed us that in that community, the chiefs would give them children as young as 10 years old, 12 years old, 14 years old to work on construction sites. And so what we did is we moved around with the children ministry and found that it is a cultural belief and value in that community that women don't work. So if you employ a woman, for example, we were trying to look at it, could we maybe replace them with women who need some money, who need to work, create some? And they said, no, a woman is supposed to get money from her husband. So if you employ a woman, then it can cause problems. What about the men? No, the men protect and they fight and they go out, so they're not supposed to work. So it remains for the children. And we managed to speak to child safeguarding, child protection cluster. And we realized that it required long-term engagement and long-term behavior change because that was the custom in that particular location. So what we did for practical purposes is the Ministry of Education and Technology had passed a bylaw to reduce the age of majority to 14 for purposes of allowing children of that age to join vocational centers. And so we thought maybe we could liaise with them to find a way of maybe ensuring that at least we would have that particular age. So this is just an example to show you. Of course, our PSCA policy and the IAC core standards indicate children under the age of 18 need to be protected. But this was an example where children working, sometimes in projects that are funded by international organizations, would be on construction sites working. Just for purposes of clarity, for us at Oxfam, all forms of child abuse, we consider them to be safeguarding issues. So I might not be talking about sexual misconduct, but so therefore that falls under our safeguarding policies. And I just wanted to share that with you from a practical perspective of how it's so difficult sometimes to have a common understanding of some of these definitions and processes. And I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edla. Coenraad, can you continue, please?
Yes, Viviana, and once again, very, very valuable and key input from Cheri and Edla on the question. And just on how can CSOs create a common understanding within the communities where programs take place about safeguarding processes, perhaps just from our context, I would like to highlight one particular aspect that was a learning for us. And I think, it's also just important to understand that as SOS Children's Villages, we work in an alternative care context. In other words, we work with children and young people who are in direct care in small group homes or in foster families, and that may also involve that children and young people are directly cared for by child and youth care practitioners. And I think it's just very important to understand that context before I make my point. But one thing that we've learned as well is that when we had initiatives that specifically targeted children and young people, for example, on raising awareness, raising awareness on issues like child rights and child abuse and safeguarding and so forth. There was at one stage where we realized that sometimes there's a danger or risk that it can be very one-sided. In other words, it is child and youth care practitioners or it's the organizations that directly inform children and young people, and they basically remain recipients of information on issues around awareness and child rights. But it's critically important to somehow bring that shift also to recognize children and young people's agency in terms of how they also affect the environment, or how they influence the environment within which they find themselves. And just to give a practical example, like to have discussions around what is appropriate or abusive behaviors. It is important to have that conversation with children, as well as child and youth care practitioners, to talk about what is understandings around what is appropriate behavior, what is abusive behavior, or what is problematic behavior. But more important, it is also important to bring that across to say, okay, but how does it influence my behavior in my interactions with peers in terms of creating a safe environment? In other words, recognizing that agency, but also getting that ideas from children and young people in terms of how their interactions can perhaps be improve or help to create a safe environment where they find themselves. But also in that sense of also getting the active suggestions from children and young people in terms of how reporting mechanisms can be made more accessible, etc., etc. Those type of practical inputs are also very critical to work towards a common understanding of how these things can be applied in the day-to-day lives of children and young people that we work with. So that's perhaps just one element I would like to highlight.
Thank you very much, Coenraad. Well, I believe that this is a very relevant topic for everyone, for all CSOs. And well, as Cheri mentioned, yes, perhaps policies, when we create policies, what we try to do is provide guidelines and provide an umbrella, let's say, a work frame for people to act in certain ways. But sometimes we can tend to create this really complex and confusing sometimes policies, because they do not take into consideration the contexts, the different contexts we're working in. And that's something very important that is, I believe, linked to what Edla mentioned regarding perhaps taking into consideration more and more each time the local costumes, the local ideas, the characteristics of the places we're working in, the ideas that people have, their beliefs, their costumes, etc., and trying to translate them into our policies, include them into our policies. And that's linked also to what Coenraad said about, for instance, with children and adolescents agency, also not only for children or adolescents, I believe, but for all population, for the organizations that do not work with children and adolescents, to promoting participation from all people, from all the communities we work with is quite important, so that our policies and our measures for safeguarding are contextualized, valid, and can be understood. That is linked to our next question regarding how do we, how can the processes that we implement guarantee adequate support for victims and survivors to be strengthened? Cheri?
Yeah, my colleagues have just made such incredible points. I've already been vigorously taking notes on things we should be more aware of as well. So just want to thank you for all of your insights. So a safeguarding policy or a model of how we use safeguarding in our organization it's only worth its salt if it really stands the test when things go wrong, right? And so I really valued Coenraad's earlier point around agency. It is so important that people who may be affected by our work understand how to engage with it and how to use it. And so there are a few things there. Firstly, I think much as though we need to make policies contextually relevant and contextually easy to onboard, we need to do the same when it comes with grievance processes. We have to understand, for example, certain gender dynamics that may play into how people would feel open to reporting when things go wrong. We have to understand that sort of having just a link on our website to report wrongdoing might not work in spaces where people are affected by low literacy rates or affected by the digital divide, which is the case in so many countries where we work. So we have to find ways that make it as easy as possible for those we're trying to protect to reach out to us when things do go wrong. And we have to be very transparent around what those methods are. Additionally, we have to really model safeguarding. It is not a policy that sort of sits on the book somewhere in a shared drive and it kind of is there, and once a year we do a little training. We have to model what we mean when we say we're creating safe spaces. And that means also being thoughtful about how we engage people and how we model good behavior. So for example, when we have a training session, how do we ensure that we model to people that there's always an opportunity to opt out of something, or that there's always an opportunity to speak to someone if you find something offensive or not aligned with your values? Modeling that we are open to having difficult conversations, I think sends a strong signal to participants around our real commitment to creating spaces that are truly safe. Additionally, we need to be very serious in our organizations around modeling consent. I think we often, when we talk about safeguarding, we look at some of the obvious issues like let's not take photos of children or vulnerable communities without their consent, for example, right? But that needs to translate also to how we look at people's data. And I think this is still a big challenge in the development sector. We collect a lot of data and use that to enrich our own programs. And by enrich, I mean improve our own programming or to improve programming within our grantee network and the donors' grant-making practices, for example. But did we get incremental consent from people for what we're going to use all of this for? Even if things are anonymized, it's another way to model to our community that your dignity and your human rights matter to us. So when we ask anything of you, we're going to tell you exactly how we're going to use that and ask you for your consent for that.
Yeah, so yeah, I agree with the two previous speakers that accountability is key, and also agency. That's very important. So again, from a very practical perspective, For us to be able to guarantee adequate support for victims and survivors, and to strengthen that, we have to look like at two angles. We have our staff, because when we talk about safeguarding, we're talking about the staff within the organization where we work. And we're also talking about our beneficiaries or the communities in need where we work. So we sort of look at it from those two perspectives. It's much, much easier to support survivors who are staff, because most agencies have medical cover, for example, or our staff would be aware of different, where to go for medical support, because at the worst extreme, medical support is really, really important for the survivor of safeguarding incidents. So victims or survivors support packages, maybe it's something to look at for organizations, that we include that kind of support within the medical cover, because there are always so many financial issues with funding support to victims and survivors. We can also liaise with GBV areas of what the UN calls GBV areas of responsibility, and GBV actors or protection and GBV teams, so that the GBV referral pathways, which are usually operational and fully funded during emergencies, is something that we are aware of, and that we all are able to feed into those. So that if you have a survivor who needs counseling, usually there would be GBV actors, protection actors on the ground during emergencies who are providing that kind of support. We need to also consider having long-term gender and GBV programs. As Cheri said, these systems show how useful they are, or the true test comes when there's a problem. So long before we have a safeguarding issue, then we need to have long-term gender and GBV programs, maybe not ours, but maybe other actors, but we work closely with them, particularly those that work towards embedding positive behavior change and challenging negative cultural practices alongside other programs. Because before an emergency happens, when we're in development mode, resilience mode, a negative cultural practice already exists. And then when we do have an emergency, it rears its ugly head, and it makes things even worse for the vulnerable people who are affected by natural disasters or man-made disasters, for example. There needs to be really serious advocacy for funding for GBV programs and GBV referral pathways during emergencies, but also when there is no emergency, and at resilience, and also within development program initiatives, so that emergencies are not the first time we are dealing with safeguarding issues when we are out responding through programs and projects. It's also important sometimes to support existing government systems, traditional systems, community systems that confidentially support GBV victims. GBV is gender-based violence. I'm trying to avoid using terminologies without explaining them. As safeguarding survivors are also GBV survivors or victims. And then there also would probably need to be strong advocacy for having medical practitioners who are trained in clinical management of rape, or CMR, to make sure that we have post-exposure prophylaxis kits or PEP kits within the medical facilities that are part of the GBV referral pathway. We need to have gender desks and child desks or special protection units within police posts and stations. And this should be happening even when there is no emergency, even when we're not having a humanitarian emergency. And then promoting psychosocial first aid training, so that we have people within the community or in the government or within the sector who are able to provide this kind of support. And also the inclusion of specific counseling for GBV survivors within counseling curriculums. These are all sort of advocacy that can be done even before we have a problem. There needs also to be work to ensure that legal and justice sectors have personnel who are trained to be sensitive to the needs of GBV survivors. And all this go to support survivors of safeguarding incidents. And it doesn't matter whether it's a formal system like, the common law, Commonwealth system, or the civil law system. Even if you have Sharia or you have traditional systems of law, we have to make sure that those legal and justice practitioners have the necessary knowledge. Apart from that, of course, there would need to be continuous training for staff and communities on rights and responsibilities around safeguarding. And in particular, for us, what we call the survivor-centered approach, which goes to improve the agency of the survivor or the victim so that they feel empowered to be able to seek support when they need it. Yeah. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Edla. Coenraad?
Thank you, Viviana. And again, very, very important points that were highlighted by the previous speakers. And I'm not going to repeat that, but just from our experience as well, a very practical measure that we recently made more explicitly clear in our processes that we're starting to implement is that, of course, we had in our policies and our approaches and the steps that we take that we need to put a focus on supporting survivors and ensuring that their medical, mental health and needs are met. But we've recently decided to also write into our steps that for each survivor, there must be a contact person whose sole responsibility it is to ensure the well-being of a survivor. And that contact person should not be part of the overall response team to the incident, because we've realized that often those things are mentioned and said, and that it's not always clear who is responsible for answering questions and who is responsible for ensuring that needs of survivors are actually followed up. And for that reason, we've made it very clear that there must be a contact person for each and every survivor when abuse occurs. And that's perhaps just a very practical measure that I want to highlight. But then in this whole context of how can we support victims and survivors more, there's another topic that I think we are not discussing enough among CSOs. And that relates to survivors who are not satisfied with whatever processes were put in place to look into their particular cases. And we've experienced in our organization that we've got a number of cases that are extremely difficult, regardless of what we put in place. Survivors continue to come back and say, we feel that we've not been appropriately heard, or that it appears that you've not recognized the severity of what we've communicated to you, or as well that we are not satisfied with how you've responded to our particular case. And this is then very challenging situations, particularly, for example, for global organizations where you've got country offices, you've got regional offices, you've got global. Some of these cases tend to escalate through the organization all the way up. And what we've also now in the meantime decided to do is to put in place an ombudsperson. We're in the process of setting that up, particularly with the view where victims or survivors are not satisfied with our response. We will make it very clear in terms of our whistleblowing mechanisms as well. If there are any complaints about how the organization responded, or if you feel you're not adequately supported, you have the option as well to approach an ombudsperson, who would also then have the role to review how we as an organization respond to complaints. And I think that is just another practical measure that we are implementing now, and that we hope in future would also help us to address some of these concerns that come out. yeah, let me leave it there. Yeah.
Thank you, Coenraad. I believe this is a very sensitive point that we're touching, because I think that all CSOs are currently working on improving their reporting mechanisms and trying to make them more accessible to all participants and communities in the places where each one of us works. But sometimes we find these situations such as what Coenraad mentioned. We have victims, we have survivors that are not satisfied with the measures that have been taken. So what do we do about them? That's one of the issues that I believe we face each day, that sometimes are not, we haven't foreseen them. We can't predict them. So some of the points that you've touched, I believe, are very important. So maybe to summarize, sensitization and training at all levels is quite important, not only to make it easier for people to report the cases where they've been victims or where they've been witnesses or know about cases of non-compliance with the safeguarding measures that we have, and also how to improve our mechanisms to maybe make more personalized the answers that we provide to the victims or survivors, to make them to try to help them to overcome the situation they've went through, and try to make them feel that we really care about them and on their well-being. So I believe that we could talk about it much longer, since it's a very complicated and sensitive issue, and also very important for these CSOs that are interested in the safeguarding measures and that should implement them. To move on and go to the next question, is something that Edla already mentioned, and is regarding resources. How do CSOs ensure that resources are allocated for safeguarding programming? Which resources would be needed to strengthen CSO safeguarding programming? Cheri?
It always comes down to resources in the end, right? In the CSO space, somehow our conversation leads us there. But this is a critical point, Viviana. We can have the best intentions of ensuring psychosocial support or physical health support to victims and survivors, but at the end of the day, if we don't have the network of practitioners who can help with that sort of support, and in addition to that, the hard, cold cash to pay for that kind of support, it very quickly means that we're not actually able to implement our safeguarding policy. And I think this is a challenge that many CSOs face, especially those of us who don't necessarily work very directly with groups who are traditionally seen as vulnerable. It can be very hard to make provision for potential safeguarding issues within a project-based budget, right? And I think this is where donor agencies really need to be our partners. If as a sector, we agree that safeguarding is important, that we want to develop and work and grow alongside communities without doing harm, then there needs to be more space to build buffers for unfortunate events or transgressions into project proposals, into our engagements and partnerships with donors and other organizations. In the absence of resources, or while we still work towards getting more resources, I think what we can do is be a resource for each other. For example, when at Accountability Lab about 2.5 years ago, we decided to take steps to really strengthen our policies around safeguarding. we knew that we didn't have the expertise necessarily in-house to help us kickstart that part of our work. And so we reached out to our counterparts and partners at the Global Fund for Children, who have way more expertise around this, and they were very generous in helping us through that period of revision. Similarly, there have been instances where we have leaned on different practitioners and on psychosocial support, where it came to support needed for our whether it be staff members or participants in our programming. But I do think that we need to be thoughtful about setting those systems up, making sure that we are collaborating with others where needed, and that we are, wherever possible, creating in the background a safety and security fund that goes beyond just our staff members, but goes to also be of benefit to participants who may find themselves in need of additional support. We've been really lucky over the last few years that one donor has made it possible for us to create such a fund. And we've created a very comprehensive framework around how we allocate funding towards what, and how that decision-making process is made, and also who's answerable for the rollout of the support. To Coenraad's earlier point, someone needs to be answerable, someone needs to be the point person who's making the decisions to support the survivor effectively.
Thank you so much, Cheri. Edla?
Yeah, so I don't want to belittle the points. I mean, it's true that if we don't have resources, then it makes it difficult for us to do what we need to do. But then there are some tips I can give on how to. I think Cheri mentioned about supporting each other, working together, being the resources for each other. So this kind of webinar, for example, we get different ideas, we get to meet each other within the network across different organizations with different visions, missions, and goals. And so sharing information like this is important. But apart from that, we have the PSCN networks. And I find that engaging with PSCN networks saves a lot of money, or saves a lot of CSOs who might not have that much funding, because it's a platform that brings together the knowledge of different agencies working on safeguarding. And then they kind of jointly do production of key messages, information, education, communication material, and other issues, and even doing advocacy in the different locations and areas where we are working on safeguarding issues with different authorities to get things done. Linking with Dbv referral pathways or gender-based violence recovery referral pathways is also a key way of supporting each other for CSOs that might not be able to get the necessary funding. Because if you have a victim or a survivor who's not part of your staff, and maybe you're not very, you don't have immediate funding, that could be a starting point. And also the earlier point about including these sorts of packages within the medical cover for staff, that would be one way of saving money. So usually there are two sources of funding for CSOs. One would be restricted funding, and that's the funding for which we write proposals, receive money. And that usually comes with restrictions on how that money is to be spent. And I think it's up to us and our funding teams, our fundraising teams, and our proposal writing project teams to challenge donors by putting in a percentage of that budget, even if it's 0.5% or 1%, for different activities in safeguarding, and even including personnel together with HR, depending on how big your program is, how much money it has, and also the level of risk in the location where you're working. And then for the unrestricted funding, which is the funding we get through maybe legacies, like, you know, philanthropists and different activities that we do for fundraising, we could also have policies to put aside a certain percentage of those funds as a matter of course, as we continue our work as CSOs. Yeah. And then also, I feel that training and awareness raising, particularly for personnel who are engaged in writing proposals, personnel who are engaged in funding or finance, to be able to understand that maybe part of their role is ensuring that a percentage of that funds goes towards activities for prevention and also for response whenever in the area of safeguarding, and also to ensure that we have some money to pay for technical staff who would support the organization. For IAC materials, if you, for example, for the reporting mechanisms, for the different trainings that you're going to have with the community, with our staff, for the suggestion boxes, for the hotlines, because they are quite expensive in some places and so on. The other thing would probably be just ensuring that you have a risk assessment done, a practical way of doing it at the beginning of the project, as we are designing the projects and activities, targeting the gaps, you know, and then having activities come out of that target those gaps and that mitigate those issues, and then include those activities and costs within the, you know, within the proposal, and then include those in the plan, and just to ensure that they're well funded. So some of the resources maybe that we would need would be risk assessment matrices for different sectors. If you're doing a protection project or a WASH project, the type of risks that you have might be different. Or for a food security project, there would be different risks with regard to safeguarding. For example, if you're doing a food security project and you have distribution points, then we need to target those people in the distributions and the people who are coming to receive the different forms of items that are being distributed, so that both parties know what their responsibilities are and what their roles are, and that both parties know where to go when they need support. That the staff know what their role is, the importance of safeguarding, the communities in need are aware of what it is, recognize it, and are able to report it. There would also be need for training tools and material for staff, and this huge quantity of training tools and materials. So just to go back to the point that Cheri mentioned earlier about working together or supporting each other. Oxfam might have training tools. Coenraad's organization might have training tools for children, and maybe we don't. Oxfam might have training tools for youth because we have youth projects and so on. So we can work around supporting each other through that. There would also need to be budget guidelines for project and program staff, because the people who write WASH proposals, for example, are not safeguarding technical people. So if we are able to provide guidelines for them to be able to do budgets based on the risks that they have assessed, then this would be useful for a useful tool for finance people or funding people when they're applying for proposals, to be able to put the budgets there. And then finally, maybe guidelines to put in place safeguarding systems when we are closing a project or during transitioning of an organization to a different structure. And that's an area that, as Oxfam we found, is very key. If you're closing down a project, then maybe that is the time when victims and survivors feel free to come out and speak. So we need to make sure that we leave in place, you know, a system, and this requires funding, of course, so that we'll be able to receive the complaints even after the organization has left the area or has transitioned to a different form. That's all I have. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Edla. Coenraad.
Well, both Cheri and Edla has already made very strong points. I actually don't have anything new to add to that, apart from just wanting to highlight what both of them mentioned. And that is, as CSOs, we need to somehow, you know, work with donors to raise more awareness for the need to, you know, to make a percentage of whatever funding, Edla mentioned 0.5 of the overall budget available for safeguarding. I think that's incredibly important. And here we also need to keep in mind that we work with different type of donors. I see that more coming in for institutional donors, but I think there's a big room still for improvement to make that part of budget, but also then with foundations and corporates, etc., etc. I think there's a lot more work needed to raise that awareness. And then I also just want to highlight that importance of working together as CSOs in networks, like Edla mentioned. Also, we had some positive experiences with the Joining Forces Alliance, where we work with other CSOs, where some of these very practical things that Edla and Cheri mentioned are also discussed and worked on as part of those networks, and that also proves to be very valuable. So I will just leave it at that.
Thank you so much to the three of you. This, as Cheri mentioned, is always the point we come to, the resources, the funding. Where are we going to find this funding? How are we going to allocate the funding that we can get? There are many priorities within our organizations, and safeguarding, as much as it is winning more and more space in time, is not usually one of the priorities. And we know that there are a lot of things that require much more funding to keep programs and projects running. So it's also, besides being an external fight, it's sometimes an internal fight, trying to find funding for the safeguarding measures. I'd like to highlight three points on what you previously mentioned. I believe that networking, helping each other, is key. Coenraad mentioned the Joining Forces Alliance. I believe is a best practice we need to take into consideration. Helping each other instead of competing between each other is much more profitable in the end, because sometimes we can achieve much more when we try to get together and act together and cooperate between each other. So for instance, as Edla mentioned, this opportunity, this webinar or other webinars or other exchange of experiences and practices is very important for us to improve our programming, improve our practices. Advocacy to raise awareness with donors regarding the importance of safeguarding, because sometimes it is a bit it's a contradiction that donors have. They ask you for certain measures and certain things that you have to have implemented, but they also do not give you the funding to ensure that these measures and these procedures are implemented. So advocating with them and raising awareness with them on the importance of being allowed to spend some of the funding on safeguarding measures is quite important. And in the end, something very important that I haven't thought about previously, but it is quite relevant, is sensitizing and training fundraising staff members on safeguarding, on both, as Edla mentioned, prevention and response, because they're the ones that are preparing the proposals, and sometimes they do not take into consideration these aspects. And also that reaches the donors. The donors do not see that in our proposals, so they do not think these are important matters to be addressed. So probably that, and also trying to promote more comprehensive work within our organizations. Is not only the people at fundraising who should be preparing the proposals. Maybe programmatic staff members should get more involved in these processes. And also us, I mean, me and Edla and Coenraad and the people who work with safeguarding within our organizations should try to reach out to our colleagues at fundraising to raise awareness among them. So thank you so much for all the answers. I believe that these are really important issues that we should address more often and more in depth. But I believe that our time is running out, right, Hector? So I'm gonna leave it, give the mic back to you, so we can wrap up our webinar.
Yeah, thank you so much. I wonder, we don't have any question on the chat, but maybe if someone has any question for any of the panelists, now is your time. Just gonna give the space of for anyone. But it doesn't seem that anyone has a question. So yeah, let's group up. So yes, thank you so much to our panelists, Cheri, Edla, and Coenraad. It has been really interesting and really happy that we have these resources, this webinar recording now for us to post in the website, and we will be uploading it very soon. And of course, thank you to you, Vivian, as well, for the facilitation of this conversation. It's been very interesting. So yes, with that, also thank you to the participants. I'm gonna stop the recording now, and good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to anyone.